Welcome. When they first asked me to speak, they sent me Mother's lecture, and I read it and then went forth and wrote what I was going to present today. This sounds like an entirely different lecture from what I read, as I'm sure you've all experienced with the dictations and things. It's just, it's why we don't study the teachings by reading just it once. We study them as we keep changing and evolving. And I realized that even in writing this, I was in a different place than when I started out writing this. But my hope today is to bring an appreciation of all of our whole community that is inside of us, of all our many parts. Some we've learned and discovered, and others are still hidden, tucked away. And so I just hope today will kind of bring out a few of those, knowing that I think we use 10% of our brain. We probably only are aware of about 10% of our parts. But each day, they just start to unfold in front of us. And so I started with our divine blueprint. With the faith that if we were created by God, He made a blueprint for us that is of His making, that has a divine origin in God. And we have tried to, I think, recreate, or at least try to picture this divine blueprint. I think that's what the field of astrology is. And I remember when we first started in therapy, we had also worked with a very amazing astrologer. And we were so excited about what he would find that we invited him into the sessions after about 6 months. And we never talked to him, but he would define the sessions. He would define what the path was that each individual person was working with. And if we hadn't gotten ourselves too much entwined in someone's search for themselves, they would literally describe the path of psychology. All our patients thought we must have, talked to them for hours to get them that wise of this unfolding. The other thing that I discovered is I never came across a boring chart. I mean, every chart and the working through of all of these influences and planets and whatever, was I could live that lifetime. Yeah, I'll take on making that puzzle. It's like when you put puzzles together, and it is the joy of putting this puzzle together, not the picture that comes out in the end. And I think I learned at that point that there was never a chart that wasn't, for me, very exciting. And it became kind of the base of the work that I did. And so I think we started out with our divine ego. Mother has helped me understand that the divine ego was very different from the human ego, which is what we studied when we studied Freud and early psychology. But this divine ego, over the lifetimes, has been kind of like the contractor that we hired it wasn't the architect, but it was the contractor to kind of put this divine blueprint into actual being. And unless people are brand new souls, we realize that some of our blueprint has been created. I mean, there are pillars inside of us that are almost immortal. We can't kick against the pricks. We can't go against our inner principles and our inner integrity. And I think that's when we find what parts of us have already been ascended. I mean, the masters have said that you ascend daily. And and it almost feels like a death of a soul if you ever go against those pricks, like you've destroyed part of your soul. And then one of those permanent parts in so many people from so many lifetimes of giving birth to children is this maternal instinct. And it's so strong, and sometimes it's not there when you're 15 and 16 and 17, you find yourself pregnant. The maternal instinct is still very small inside of you, and the desire to evolve and grow and the ascension spiral is much, much stronger. And so you make the decisions where you're not experiencing that maternal instinct. And those are the decisions to really abort the child, because yourself and your search and whatever take priority over this maternal instinct. And people have said to me that I could not take a look at the child because I knew if I took a look at the child, I would never go through with the abortion. Or people have had experiences in dreams, actually, a dream of somebody the night before the abortion, where this nurse took this child and held it up in this little sack, and the little child was waving goodbye to the mother. And this was a young girl, and she said that's it. She canceled the abortion for the next day. And but finding that maternal instinct is one of those instincts that grow and get stronger and stronger, and that need to cherish and to care and to stop the car on the freeway and rescue the animal, to go and rescue the child, drives, fulfills a lot of that strength of that maternal instinct. And but as Margaret Paul said at the beginning of the book, that there are all of these conditions that don't have a maternal instinct in them, of not caring and not valuing and not protecting and not shepherding souls. And in fact, this maternal instinct is so strong that firemen are taught that if a mother ever thinks her child is in a house that's burning, you do not get in the way of this. And I remember I was in kind of a community. I was in somebody else's house, and the fire engines came, and my 3 children were sleeping in my house not very far away. And I went bolting out of that house, and this fireman came up and grabbed my arm, and he went running with me. And I was halfway across the green, and I said to him, "The fire's the other way, isn't it?" And he said, "We never, ever get in the way of a mother going after her children. We have learned the hard way." That's how strong and powerful and empowering this instinct was. And then that brought me back to the teachings when Mother gave. Well, there are a couple parts. One is that in the early days of the Bible, these souls used to live till 800 and 900 years. And I always said, what happened? How did they had the same bodies that we did, but they lived till 900 years. And so something something happened prior to the flood that stopped the energy from evolving and growing. And Mother has said that the first 3 root races all ascended. So I've always wondered what happened. And then Mother taught about the fall of the angels, and that it was a rebellion against God. But there were 1/3 of the angels fell. And I said, yeah, that's an awful lot of angels that are mortal and have worked, I mean, they've gotten to the level of angels. They've gotten to this very high thing. How could they all have felt? And what God had asked them to do, that they rebelled from, was that they were to go down, and these civilizations that were evolving on Earth were not as evolved. They certainly weren't immortal yet. They weren't as evolved as the angels. And they were to go down, as angels do, and tend them, and protect them, and nourish them, and guide them. And they who had been evidently practicing or putting on the performances of civilizations that had fallen, refused to do this, and that was what the core rebellion was. And it dawned on me then that the need to be, they have to be me, they have to be important, they have to put themselves first, and they were not going to be the servants of, these. I mean, what the maternal instinct is we really take souls that can't walk, they can't talk, they're dumb, they're stupid. They're really much less evolved than we are as mothers. And yet we take and we serve them. We serve their every needs. We exhaust ourselves. We do all the things that mothers do in raising the children. And that somehow that must have been set aside or not honored in this very normal request of God to be a mother. And that was what that rebellion was. And so why is it important for us to even think about the psychology? Because when they came down to earth, God withdrew his power from them and they were brought down to earth. And they formed these civilizations. And they then created, because they needed to have their needs met, they created kind of birth goddesses. This is actually in Genesis. It's 2 Genesis stories, the fall of Eve, and then the birth goddesses that created the sons of man, and then the sons of God, who were the fallen angels and were still immortal, saw the sons of man, and they were very beautiful, and so they intermarried, and then we had Nephilim and giants roaming the earth. But they were still in these civilizations that we never learned about until we excavated the libraries of Ashurbanipal and discovered that all of these civilizations, that God was having David go and kill every man, woman, and child, and Enoch have a whole book in the middle of the Bible of the cities and the lineages and the names of the families, and the warning, don't intermarry in these civilizations. But they did exist, and of course they were very, they were mortal. They were very smart and intelligent and charismatic and whatever. And we went then and intermarried. And the consequences of that was that we took into our body the seeds of this original rebellion. And this battle then that we had internally against the mother instinct of raising our own children, our own child, teaching, mentoring, giving, serving, was intermixed alongside of the philosophy of, I've got to be me, I have to do my own thing, I am going to be most important. it was kind of the core of the humanistic psychology, which, by the way, I trained and studied in. And I was absolutely shocked the day that I sat in the chapel and listened to Mother read the kind of 10 principles of humanistic psychology, which, by the way, is a step that everyone has to go through. They do have to empower themselves in order to start the ascension spiral. They have to bring something to the ascension spiral. And she compared it with the 10 principles of the Satanic Bible, and they matched. And it's, I have to do my thing, you could do your thing. If we met, whatever. I'm not going to repeat those. But it was a major turning point in my life because that was in my psychology, that was in my genes. And then the other piece that I put into this is the Ayurvedic teachings, which says that in your DNA, that 25% of your DNA comes from your mother, and 25% comes from your father, and 25% comes from past lifetimes. And we only have 25% of ourselves that we actually make a free will choice. No, I don't want that quality in me. I'm going to do the work to pull up that weed or whatever. And the rest of it is this kind of automatic identity that is a very, very strong pull on us. And of course, I've found therapy in my own therapy that when people are younger, they really have to work on their mothers because they start working on their mothers in therapy because it's such a pull, because they will tend to be treating themselves how their mothers treated them. And that they really have this responsibility for taking, for starting the mother inside of them now on the ascension spiral. And that ascension spiral is the path that says, I want to evolve, I want to go forward, I want to, it's the can-do spirit, I want to learn how to do this, that we see very early, arriving, and I'm going to do it by myself, Mommy. It's the beginning of this ascension spiral. And that they have to take it like the next step. Wherever their parents were stuck, they have to go the next step. And so you find that when a parent didn't get educated, their children want to be educated. When a parent was in a bad marriage and stayed in a bad marriage, then the child goes into a bad marriage and gets divorced. They have to kind of find a solution for wherever it was that the parents got stuck. If the parents abandon them, then they stick out a relationship at all costs, even though they may not be happy there. I remember a patient telling me that her father had to, when he was a child, had to give up his dreams to go and become a lawyer because his father had died and he had to become the breadwinner of the family, and they had 8 children or something. But he made sure all those kids got to college, and she got to the point and she went into college to register, and she was going to register being an attorney. She was going to go into law school. And she got to the desk that said law school, and she said, what am I doing here? This isn't what I want. But she had completed what her father hadn't completed, and she turned and became a writer, and was an entirely different direction, of course. But it's almost like you follow your parents' divine calling. You see this in parents where in children where they've had to live with alcoholic parents, and they make a decision they're just not going to drink at all. And I've even found that there's a place in the chart that shows you're going to be alcoholic. I found that would get read, but their decision not to be the way their father was so strong that it freed them really from what was even inherently inside of them and inside their DNA. And and also, so we've had this internalization then of the psychology of the fallen ones. And so in all the training and understanding of the ego, I realized that and Mother termed that ego the human ego, and that there was another ego called the divine ego, whose purpose is to build this kind of temple, to build the construct of your individualized identity in God. And it split and divided all of our 4 lower bodies. Like we have 4 lower bodies, the spiritual, the mental, the emotional, and the physical. And it divided it in half. And we had these split inside of ourselves. And the lower body was actually the internalization then of the rebellion of the fallen consciousness of the fallen angels inside of ourselves that has been the ego. And that the ego, remember, got formed when the light, of course, the light got withdrawn. And so the upward spiral toward, finding your mission and your divine plan and your twin flame and your spiral, goes on up, was sadly interrupted by the psychology of the fallen angels that came and intermarried into our DNA, where the vertical connections were what was, the vertical connections became stronger than these vertical connections, or at least a battle of some degrees inside of all of us. And so they became God. And what became God was, their approval, their forming really a master-slave relationship. And the result is our emotional body, which Buddha says should be kind of a crystal clear lake, and probably was the early times. It became full of all of the reactions to what happens when someone puts themselves in the position of God over you. And so at the basis of all of what we call the neuroses and psychoses inside of our emotional body have a power struggle over who is going to be in charge of you, who's going to be in control. Of course, one of the ways of getting into control over somebody else is to get condemning of them, put them down. Need to be great. I need to be perfect. I need to be the one that is esteemed and in charge. And then you have to kind of build defenses against this, or you'll go out of existence. And so now we have this emotional body with all of its defenses, and which we've called as a dweller. And this all happened after the fallen angels were cast down to earth. And I realized that the energy that used to propel us to being 800 and 900 years somehow got plugged up and never got to us, or only 1/10 of it got through. And now it was like the soul that used to just swim across this lake into our heart and into the caring and the warmth and the comfort, had to man these waves and get through these waves, and that it took so much energy going through our emotional body that it was exhausting, and there wasn't very much energy left to live on. And even even the victory of getting through the emotional body and lighting up our hearts were very, very diminished. Our flame went down to 1/6%, and there wasn't enough energy to sustain itself. I think that's part of what old age is. It's just you finally just kind of run out of energy. And when you run out of energy, then it's hard to sustain the body in a living light space. So things just become slower and slower and slower, and then we get into the death spiral instead of the life spiral. It's the ascension life. I think I did have to set my heights at least a little higher, because I had to have an immaculate concept that would be there for every time I wanted to sit down at television, every time I wanted to get dependent, every time I wanted to not do things. I could see this death spiral growing, and I said, listen, I better just push up I better push the goal a little further out so I could keep on the ascension spiral. And it's very hard as you get older to choose not to collapse, or not to be dependent, or not to have other people do things for you, but to keep striving, just keep expanding and keep searching. It's a trouble. You can tell the governments that are run by the fallen angels, because the first thing they do is to say, we'll take all your initiations for you. We will give you your maintenance, the government will give you everything. And that becomes kind of a socialist government. We're not going to leave you with any initiations at all, because if you start to take initiations, you're going to start on that upward ascension spiral. So we're going to nip it in the bud by just making you dependent, from the beginning. And then even in this amazing experiment that our early forefathers gave to us in America, they said, wait a minute, we're going to give all the power to the child, to the people, and they're going to have to do something with it and grow up, and they're going to have to learn by the pain and the suffering and the hard knocks and all the difficulties. They're going to have to master those in the path of initiation. And we're not going to make it easy. We're not going to give anybody anything. They're on their own. And then another piece we got from Kuan Yin was that this pull to pleasure and comfort, and the pull to forging ahead, which means pain and difficulties and boulders we have to climb, that the Kuan Yin said that we have it all along, this, seeking pleasure, comfort, rather than seeking pain. We just have it upside down. We're supposed to seek pain rather than seek comfort and pleasure, because that's where we learn. As you look back on your life, you don't go back to, those nice times where you just sat in the comfy chair and watched thing. You go to the things that were really, really tough, because at the end, then you have the mastery, and that becomes the victory, and that's the spark of life that keeps you on and going on to the next step. So, my speech. The splitting. So then the direction, the ascension spiral got split, and half of it went out into the horizontal spiral, which of course gets us into the rounds of death and rebirth. And then after the fallen angels came, no one, or few people ascended. It wasn't before everybody ascended. The first 3 root races didn't ascend. And the 4th root race still's here. It's probably in this room. We're still trying to make it through. And so as we lower that into now the mental body, our mental body split too. We actually have and I don't know if this was in the first three root races, I don't know if they just had one mind, but we have two minds. We physically have two minds that are part of our mind. And one is our critical thinking mind, and it's it's a smaller of the mind, actually. Our mind that we can get brainwashed with and indoctrinated is part of what's called the emotional mind. And the critical thinking mind is present, is where the seat of our free will choice is, which is the gift basically from God. It's where we take the initiations. I'm going to go right or I'm going to go left. But that critical mind, there's this book out that's in my recommendations. I was shocked when I learned that that critical mind does not work if you haven't had 6 hours of sleep. That's when it resets itself. 6 hours of sleep. So if you try to push your sleep and you don't get up, then all you're left is your limbic mind that just downloads whatever you get an emotion, whatever emotion. Remember, if the emotions in the lower body are because of the out of balance state of our out of alignment state with our higher self, then what we're downloading is all the perversions of the psychology of the fallen angels. And that's what we're remembering. When Mother talks about remembering the lies, that's what we are remembering. And remember, the fallen angels, because of their need to be God, one of the other characteristics of them is that they do not care for, and they do not nurture, and they do not protect the people that they are in charge of. And so you end up with these households where it's a master-slave relationship, and you have children because you need to have free labor on the farm, or you have children so the child could take care of you in your old age. It's the intent of the heart, rather than you have a child and, oh my gosh, think of all the work I have to do for the next child, or all that I have to teach and all that I have to empower this child so that they can grow and lead. So so this critical mind really makes this decision as to what is important. You know, they can start to dissect the lies. So let's say a child is raised by, under the psychology of the fallen angels and is not valued. You know, it's a little bit like in the not just families, but even in the philosophy of management in the workplace. I've had a honor of being with somebody who's been trained to use employees. And if they don't do what we want, this is the philosophy, if they don't do what we want, we just fire them. And I say, no, we're responsible for them. They came to us. You know, we have to leave them in a better place than what we found them. And we've had these we run, every other business runs it on fear. You make these rules, and if they don't bother, if they don't pay attention to these rules, they don't come into conformity, you just let them go. And I'm saying, no, we have a higher responsibility for them than that. And so the person that's now my partner has said, Lucy, nobody runs businesses the way you run businesses. This is ridiculous. This is crazy. This is whatever. And we've had this constant running. Well, it's now been 14 years, and he's now fallen in love. He's now had a child. He's now felt that maternal instinct, and he says he's done a 180-degree turn, and nobody has gotten fired for a long time. And it's the same thing in governments. You know, you promise whatever, but you don't deliver it. You know, or the motivations for yourself. If you're going to get reelected, or if you're going to be able to take the money and fill your pockets or whatever. It's just where the intent of the heart is you can tell where it's aligned. You know, is it aligned toward this split of the Christ self, or is it aligned toward the things of this world, which is greed and want, you know, I have to do what I want, you know, I have to get what I want. And so you have all the intents dictate then the, you know, the greed, dictate all kind of the gods of this world, which are, you know, the greed, the wanting things for yourself, making sure your own needs get met, even to the point where your needs are met, and then all you can do is just make bigger and bigger and bigger needs. There's some point to where you have enough, and your job is done in nourishing yourself. You have enough, and now it's time to begin that trek upwards. And then you go into the emotional body, and it's divided. So you have all the feelings of the heart, which is where the caring, and it's where the maternal instinct is. The caring for other people, the valuing the other people, the responsibility to develop in your own children their own individualized self. And then you have the part that really doesn't want to give. There isn't a feeling for that child. I mean, most of us have both parts inside of ourselves. Oh, and the one piece I forgot, also a little piece, is in the Bible it says the sins of the father will visit down 4 generations. So whenever the seed of darkness got intermarried into our psychology, you know, it's still with us, falling down. And so inside of, and we want to always, by the way, see that evil and unlawful desires are outside in other people, because we don't like that part, so we project it onto other people. But part of discovering yourself is to take back all the projections, you know, that you make into other people and re-own them into yourself, and you generally will find whatever you accuse somebody else in is inside of yourself. But those are people who search themselves, and people who don't, everything is outside. It's why when people run they run for office, their way of running for office is to say how horrible it is, to project all their bad parts into the other candidate and find examples of how bad that candidate is. And the creativity of their own stands, their own way of running, and their own ideas is almost, they don't have a platform to run on. Their only platform is to attack the other people for not being perfect. And this thing of not being perfect, again, is, and it permeates so many things. It's if you, in fact, like the Roman psychology was, they idolized perfection, and then, which you never can get, you know. And the distance between the image, it's how you create kind of this false image, and the reality is the amount of condemnation you have inside of yourself. You know, when you can accept yourself and the truth of yourself where you are, the condemnation goes away. But if you start to create an image or a synthetic self or a false self and empower that false self, then the distance is the degree of condemnation you have for yourself and also for other people. It's very interesting when entities first come, and people who end up hearing voices can actually hear the entities. They have their own psychology, and the first thing they do is to idolize the person. You know, you've been specially chosen, you are going to lead people out of darkness or whatever, you are going to be the next leader, you're going to, and they'll take sometimes these people that have not even been able to function in their own life, and get their own life together, and tell them all these wonderful things. They start out with idolatry. And that may go on for a couple of years. And oftentimes people are very guarded about hearing voices because they were becoming best friends with them. And only after that does all the condemnation start. It's constantly 24 hours a day, and that's when people end up going crazy. But people can live with voices for about 2 or 3 years as long as they're idolizing them. We can live with husbands and wives and bosses and things like that if they are idolizing us. But in the end, it's going to turn into shame and condemnation. And then down to the physical body. When this, as Mother said, when this drops into the physical body, she has said that we have a energized physical body or we have a drained physical body. And when it gets drained, everything that has not ever been resolved in our emotional body falls out into our physical body. And our physical body is an energetic body. And but it's our densest body, and so it generally is very, very honest. So, for example, if you have back problems, probably, Carolyn Mice tried to, and other people have also tried to listen to the wisdom of the physical body. But it's like, you just put one load too many on your back and they'll have back problems. Or, the hysterical conversions are typical of a physical body acting out what you could not act out in your emotional or mental bodies. And that would be the man that fell in love with his image that he put on top of this girl. And then after living with her and dating, he realizes she wasn't that image. And the person that she is wasn't somebody that he loves. But now they're already into a marriage, or they're already into the wedding, all the plans, the guests have been invited. He can't lose face, but he really does not want to marry this girl. But he has to go along with the wedding, and so he's walking on the way to the church, and his legs go totally paralyzed. And finally his legs said no. Very honest. Your body is oftentimes very honest. And if you look into what is the meaning of illnesses. And like Mary Baker Eddy said, if you can make the connection to the higher self, the illnesses will go away. And which we have found. There's spontaneous remission, there's faith healing, there's change in lifestyles where the illnesses just disappeared. There's been the psychic healings where they brought an energy onto a person and the illnesses went away, and then they went back out into the world, but they didn't change their psychology, so the illnesses came back, and they called all the faith healers fakes and whatever, because, as Jesus said, go and sin no more, or a worse thing will return to you. Well, we discovered that when other people were laying hands on, the miracles that we saw with Benny Hinn and the healers, where they can connect the energy to your higher self, and then the illnesses will go away. I found in therapy sometimes that by even understanding what the body is saying and taking the free will choice and changing your psychology, that the illnesses will start to fall away. And Mother has said that, I think in Climb the Highest Mountain, one of our very first chapters, is the Masters have said that all illnesses are karmic. And so the first place to look is to look inside your own psychology, to what is the self-destructive burdens that you're putting on your own body that, cycled all the way from your etheric into your mind, all the way, didn't get transmuted in your heart and created all these waves in the solar plexus and then fell out into your physical body. So this becomes kind of a framework of how do we now reverse the spiral? How do we reconnect, very much like Mary Baker Eddy did, where she just went into prayer and reconnected back to her higher self. And the illness that she was struggling with, which was incurable, disappeared. And there's lots of stories like this. So I think we have to start with the physical because it's kind of the core of our physical energies. And here we have this fight between the pharmaceutical companies that said, we're going to do it for you. There's something wrong with you, and we're going to fix it for you. And this is an unpopular thing to say, but the second leading cause of death are doctors, are the pharmaceuticals, the side effects to our attempt to try to make and fix the body. And so we have the counterpart now that is gaining a lot of momentum in the functional body. And the functional doctors said, I'm not going to deal with your illness, I'm going to deal with your body. So you start from the beginning. Buddha has said that there's four poisons to each one of our bodies. Sugar is the poison for our physical, alcohol is the poison for our emotional, cigarette smoking is the poison for our mental. It actually creates kind of a cloud of smoke and you don't pick up the higher vibrations. And drugs is the poison for our spiritual. And it's why sometimes kids can take drugs and they don't see the damage that they're doing. As my son, who came to me one day, and I had my children so scared by taking a look at people that were in the office that they really did never pick up the drugs. But he came to me and said, Mommy, I have all these friends and they're doing marijuana on the weekends. And every single weekend they're doing marijuanas and they're getting A's and I'm getting B's. But I said, just wait and see what happens. And sure enough, one by one, they woke up one day and they disconnected from their dharma and their mission, their purpose and their higher planes. And they looked at each other and why are we going to school? And so they would drop out of school because they finally disconnected from their higher mind. But that's not where it stops. So you get rid of the addictions. Anything you're addicted to is basically a horizontal attachment where you do not get addicted to fresh vegetables as much as we try. It's just not one of those things when you want comfort that you go and steam your fresh vegetables. Unless, I've worked with this a little bit. If you put this very pure coconut oil on, called MCT oil, and you put those on your vegetables, and some sea salt, because it doesn't have as much salt on, you almost can make it into something that's addictive. But it takes a little tweaking, a little spices and whatever. And so the next level that the functional doctors will take is outgo all the rest of the comfort foods, outgo the wheat and the gluten things. And, and they're making non-gluten substitutes that they're not quite as good because they're not addictive as much addictive. But you can put this MCT on top of the bread and it actually tastes halfway decent. But outgo the dairy products, outgo anything that creates the inflammation, outgo the toxins, outgo the chemicals, the sprays, and start into the organic, non-GMO, non-sprayed things. And then outgo the omega-6 oils, and you have just omega-3 oils. So, of course, outgoes most of your meat, except the ones that are grass-fed, because they happen to have omega-3 oils, or more omega-3s than omega-6s. And then you kind of keep climbing up the ladder. And then you'll find that your your body gets out of balance. You know, the yin yang things and a lot of the teachings we've had, how do you bring your body back into balance? Well, now they give you this blood work and you see what you're missing and you start to supplement, you know, iron or whatever it is to bring your body back into balance. And then the next level is that there's certain foods, we do not know why, but there's certain foods that people have allergies to. And so you take all of those out of your diet. And pretty soon there's no snack foods left. there's nuts, but I've even been told that you have to limit the nuts to a half a cup. So you have to put limits on it. And then you do finally get to a place where your hunger, it's like fasting. When you give up food, period, you go through this next day that's terrible, you're really hungry, but then you go to a place where the attachments, the hunger, the desires actually diminish. And that's what happens as you raise the vibration of the food, and you end up getting more energy in your physical body. Is why people do it. You can think more clearly. Your illnesses go away. So it's a really great place to start for everybody. And we've basically done a restaurant, and that's where we started. And we're not very rigid about it, but fairly rigid on about 80% of it. But people don't know. What we did is we actually put everybody on the spiritual path upward without their knowing, by just purifying their bodies. So it's a great start if people aren't even interested in connecting to their higher self. They can recognize the energy that is created in their bodies. And then you have to work, then you go and you grab this soul that's been battered and tossed, and you start to drag it across this samsara, the river of samsara, to get to the promised land, which is the heart on the other side, which has it's the lowest point to where the I am presence energies sink. And you battle with the defenses and it's basically what psychology is. You fight the wars and you do this Herculean attempt to get to the place where your emotions no longer create waves. And I've always seen this emotional body. I think God in his wisdom gave us this lovely emotional body to show us when we're out of alignment with our higher self. And over the years, as I've taken a look at every single feeling and boiled it down to its simplest denominator, I think the waves in the emotional body are created by you becoming God over somebody else, or you're allowing somebody else to become God over you. I think that it's simplifying this struggle with the emotional body, but at its very basic roots, I think it is that choice between the identity with light and with God and the identity with the fallen angels. And I'm not going to go through all of that today because well, I'll just do one thing. Okay. Anger. Okay. Now you find that if what creates anger is, let's say I decide that you should be the way I want you to be. You know, gray hair, right? With a few wrinkles. And so I walk out of my body and I go into your body and I sit high up in the God position, unlawfully, by the way, and start to tell you how to be. And it comes out as criticism and condemnation. You should cut your hair, you should take the color, whatever. And on my way out of my body, I start to get irritation, annoyance, irritation, anger, rage, and murder. In the end, is the end. Finally, the end result, I just have to get rid of you. For some little tiny thing. And you'll see people have killed other people over little tiny arguments that they had, back in, because that's a continuum of this anger, but it's a continuum of you thinking you actually are superior and you know more of what that person should be than they do. The need to be right, all of those things are in the emotional body. Once you get to the heart, then I think this is where the great commandments come in. The first 2 commandments, where you start to love yourself and all your parts, and and you start to trust yourself, and you start to empower yourself. And then when you can do that with yourself, then you can love someone else like you love yourself. You do really have to love yourself first. Mother's book on the twin flames, find your twin flame. The first part of that book, from what I can remember, is how to love yourself, that you have to fall in love with yourself before you can even trust that somebody else is going to fall in love with you. And when you start to care for someone else like you care for yourself, not greater, not lesser, but like you care for yourself, then you start into this universal oneness, all-encompassing, where you have a right to live at whatever space you are, and I have a right to be at whatever space. And if I happen to know more than you, then I will teach you. If I know less than you, then I will learn from you. And if we know about the same, I'll become your best friend. If we match. And so the relationships stay not rigid. Because they're in flux, they're in flow, they can change. The ego is very rigid, by the way, in contrast. And now you go to your mind. And you've got to get the critical mind back, because otherwise this is where you start to sort out what was a lie and what wasn't a lie. You have to look at it and be critical. So, for example, a child who was in a family where the parents were going through bankruptcy, they had 4 other children, there just wasn't energy left for this child. It wasn't that they hated him, it's just that they were, they were, peaked out at what their ability was. But the child interpreted that I am unlovable, because children are very pure. They come in from the retreats. There's no ego in them. If something happens in the household, it's their fault. If mommy's unhappy, it's what did I do, mommy? They're very humble. They're very, they take accountability for everything, that happens. And so that's where the lies start to build. It's not even that parents are putting lies into them, but they themselves are just taking the accountability for the whole world for whatever goes wrong with the family. Now, if parents add to that, you kids are driving me crazy. Or, the father's just been attacked at work, or he's been fired, and he comes home and he says, get out of here, or whatever. The parents can add to that burden that the child already is taking. Or the parents can transmute. It just depends where they are tied into. If they're tied into the higher part of themselves, their response to a child is very different than when they're tied into using their children as dumping grounds for all their inadequate parts. And so then the critical mind can start to basically do the healing by just awareness. It's where this quality of awareness is in many of the teachings, where you just start to take a look at yourself and you start to have to sort out the truth from the lies. And then you have to start, we start out in therapy, we start out with everything. If you want to find all your missing parts, by the way, see that you've destroyed inside of yourself. See what you hate in everybody else. and then take those parts and stick them back into your body, and you'll find your missing parts. You'll, you know, it is a faculty of reasoning. It's a faculty, you know, of learning. It's a faculty of becoming aware that there's a difference between greed and the maternal instinct, for example. There's a difference in vibration between it. And then you keep your free will choice as long as you can manage. It usually gets filled up pretty quickly in a day. But ever since reading that book, I religiously now go to bed after 6 hours. Now, you really need 8 hours, but what happens to the brain is the last 2 hours is washing out all the toxics and toxic things, all the things that will create Alzheimer's and stuff. So it's cleansing, but you can get away without taking a shower and live, but you can't get away without your critical mind. And so at least get your critical mind and then do make up sleep. You know, to have a nice shower or a bath, you know, at the end of the week or the end of every 3 or 4 days or however dirty you want to contain in your mind. And then the next thing, you're on this kind of upward track. So the next thing is to start to just pay attention. Oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry. Before that, what Jung talks about is you also pay attention to your shadow. So underneath even the best intents and the purest of hearts, and you look at the intents of caring for other people, listen to the shadow. Oh, I think if I take them over these biscuits, she's going to love me for life. And you just take, you know, I really think that if I say just the right thing, you're going to accept me. You'll hear the shadow inside of you'll hear the psychology of darkness. I want to be better. If I do really good at this presentation, you're going to think I was a really great speaker. You can just hear it. It just follows. You know, it's like a little shadow. And that is the psychology of darkness that takes a lot to try to root it out and not empower it and not express it and not certainly put your whole identity on it. And so now we're on the way up, and we now go to our intuition. We start being aware of our intuition. Now, what our intuition is something that knows more than what we do. We cannot figure out what our intuition is, except sometimes in retrospect. I knew I shouldn't have gone that direction, and yet I did. And at first you just look at it in retrospect. You know, I shouldn't have hired that person, or whatever it is. It knows more than what your critical mind knows. And so you start to just kind of welcome it into your world. Google has presentations in front of them. They do a whole investment, venture capitalist part of Google. And they have 6 people. And they listen to all the presentations. And they don't make any judgment. This is their instructions. They go to bed. They wake up in the next morning after 6 hours of sleep. And they trust what their gut says. And if their gut says, don't take it, it becomes a thumbs down. They will only finance, and there can be millions to people, they will only finance when 6 people all do thumbs up. That's how they make their decisions. It's the top corporation. They don't make it by the critical mind because you can be fooled. They use the intuition. In preparing for the speech, I took ChatGPT. I think there was some positive use of it. And I wanted to see if anybody's ever put together a book of stories of people who were not at the Twin Towers at the time that it was attacked. And there are normally, in a day, there were 150,000 people employed full-time that worked at the Twin Towers. That day of the attacks, there were 47,000 people that were there, 400 people that were there at 8:45 when the planes hit. And there had been wonderful stories. And ChatGPT pulled together probably about 15 of those stories. And I began to recognize how this intuition manifested itself in these people. There was one person that just had a premonition, a direct premonition that something was going to happen to the Twin Towers, and decided to trust it and not go in. Then there were a few people, like these Google people, that they just got up and their gut there was just something wrong with their gut, and they learned to trust it, and they didn't go in. They called them sick and whatever. And then there were people that just were lethargic. They just really didn't want to go in for the day. They found themselves dragging, taking an extra cup of coffee. They just couldn't get themselves together. So their duty still propelled them, and they were late. But they got there after 8:45 when the Twin Towers hit. And then there were people where the distractions, they empowered distractions. Why they empowered distractions, you don't know except in retrospect. But it was like the minister takes the train in, sees drunks always in the corner of the train stations. This one particular time, he looked at this man. He was really out. He said, I think he needs some help. And he was supposed to have a meeting at 8 o'clock on the top of the Twin Towers, the restaurant. And he got out there and made sure that the guy was okay, made sure he had a cup of coffee, and he talked to him for a while. And he got back into, and made a decision that he would just be late for his meeting. He got back into the train and got to the Twin Towers at 8:30, 8:35, walked into the Twin Towers and was waiting for the elevator to take him up to that floor when the whole, does that mean I'm out of time? Okay. When the whole thing collapsed. And then the very last thing is, and then the intuition, the next place is your higher self. And this is the energy of vibrations, the energy that you feel when you make a connection to your higher self, your peak experiences in your life, the miracles that are in your life, the things that change yourself around that like when you first hear dictation, you will never be the same again because you've tuned into a much higher form of consciousness. And I will close on that note.